Hi everyone, this is Joe. Welcome to my channel. Thanks for tuning in. I just finished a pretty intense match against Elves. I didn't record it while I was playing it, but it was so interesting that through the wonders of Cockatrice's replay feature, I'm going to show you how the match went. So we'll go ahead and get the first game playing. It's nice that we have a fast forward feature. I had to wait a moment for an opponent to join. And of course, we always take a little while thinking about our opening hands. You can see that the Merfolk have a really nice hand here. Island, Mutavault, AEther Vial. 1-drop creature, 2-drop creature, 3-drop creature. Hitting our curve with access to Spreading Seas if the opponent plays a land that looks like a good target for Spreading Seas. You can see that the Elves opponent has only one land, but he has 3 1-drops, an Elvish Visionary to draw him into more cards, Dwynen's Elite to increase his board presence, and combo with Heritage Druid. So on the draw, I think this is a reasonable decision as a keep for the Elves player. I have a lot of Elves experience myself. I play mono-green Elves in Modern, as well as Merfolk, though Merfolk is far and away the deck that I play the most. So again, it's a narrow keep, but a reasonable keep for the opponent being on the draw. So I'm going to go ahead, continue with this. I'll play Island, AEther Vial. The opponent does hit a land, making the hand much, much better. He plays Heritage Druid into next turn, possibly Dwynen's Elite, making 3 Elves to produce 3 mana with Heritage Druid and drop more of his hand. Seeing a Horizon Canopy, Razorverge Thicket, Spreading Seas does have a very attractive target, so we go ahead and attach that to the Razorverge Thicket. Now the opponent could play the Forest and the Dwynen's Elite, giving him 3 Elves for still access to Heritage Druid's ability, being able to unload most of his hand. However, he chooses to go a different route, playing a Nettle Sentinel potentially for... Well, it's really hard to say why here. Nettle Sentinel does have, he can untap next turn after attacking, and he can go ahead and play more Elves. But seems like a slight misstep for the opponent. Dwynen's Elite would have been the better choice here. We're seeing another potential misstep here in the attack with Heritage Druid, with AEther Vial on 1. Playing against Merfolk, he should know that I can bring in a creature and block the Heritage Druid. I guess the reason he does this is he has another Heritage Druid in hand, but being so limited on mana, the opponent should really be looking to keep as many creatures on board as possible to produce as much mana as he can in order to just turn on his hand and use Fauna Shaman eventually to give him access to Izuri for the overrun effect or Archdruid for pumping his team. In any event, I play the Cursecatcher and block the Heritage Druid. They trade and I untap. I draw a Lord. With the land that I drew last turn, this hand is developing quite nicely. I myself make a slight misstep rushing to play Minamo into Merrow Reejerey, whereas I should have probably used AEther Vial to put Silvergill into play to see what land I drew first. Sometimes it's going to be correct if we draw Mutavault to play the Mutavault on turn 3, so we have access to potentially attack with 2 Mutavaults. The following turn, on turn 4, bringing in a Lord to buff the Mutavaults. But I go ahead and play the Minamo, seeing the land in my hand to get my 3-drop on the table. And we pass the turn with the intention of putting in Silvergill at the end of the opponent's turn. The opponent continues to not hit lands. I attacks with the Nettle Sentinel. I take 2, declining to bring in a Silvergill and block, as I feel that now is the time that we want to start establishing a strong board and take advantage of our Island Walk to end the game. Took 2 damage. The opponent now decides to play the Dwynen's Elite, untapping Nettle Sentinel and creating an Elf Warrior token. The opponent, if he had still had his Heritage Druid, would have then had access to at least 3 mana to play something like Visionary, another Heritage Druid, Elvish Mystic. All of those spells could have been on the table if he had played Dwynen's Elite on turn 2 instead of the Nettle Sentinel. I bring in Silvergill, and we see I do, in fact, hit the Mutavault. The way that this plays out next turn, I wasn't going to attack with 2 Mutavaults anyway, but it's always important when you have something like a Silvergill Adept or a Spreading Seas in hand, which is going to draw you a card, to wait to make your land drop if possible, just to have complete information before committing a land to the table. Okay, so we go ahead, untap, draw Spreading Seas again. With the opponent so starved for mana, this is a very high priority for us. We already have a Heritage Druid off the table, and the fact that he hasn't followed up with another one made me think that he probably doesn't have access to another one. So the play this turn, I had to think about it a little bit. I didn't want to make any missteps since we seem to have such an advantage. Go ahead and play Silvergill first in order to then untap land and continue playing spells. Silvergill drew me another Lord, which is going to help us win quicker. And I decide then to deploy the Spreading Seas, which is going to draw me another card. I drew another Lord. I can go ahead and drop the Mutavault onto the table, attack for 7 damage. The opponent takes it through Island Walk and doesn't draw land, has no access to mana, and just scoops for game 1. We'll go ahead and move on to game 2. My sideboard plan for this matchup right now is to bring in the 3 Tidebinder Mages, since they're great. Bring in a couple of Dispels, not quite the full 3 Dispels, just 2, because it's still a very aggressive matchup, and we really don't want to get stuck with 2 or 3 Dispels in hand. You can see this opener is very decent. I have access to removal for his early explosive plays, and then can continue to develop my board with 2 Lords, and potentially draw into more Merfolk, Spreading Seas. Now the opponent is on the play. He has another 1 land hand, but this time he has actual mana dorks to back them up. So this is a much more reasonable keep, even on the play, than his 1 lander last game. So I choose to keep this. It's got some nice disruption in hand. The opponent opens with Razorverge Thicket into Llanowar Elf. I draw Tidebinder Mage, which is great in this matchup, in order to prevent a really explosive opening, assuming he has another land in hand, and can play 1-drop, including Heritage Druid for 3 mana, and just drop his whole hand. I choose to take him off of the Mana Dork on turn 1, going down to 16 life. The opponent still only has 1 land, plays out another Mana Dork, just repeats his first turn. Again, trying to limit his mana, we play out a Tidebinder Mage to lock down his Elvish Mystic. We've drawn into Tidebinder Mage and another Lord, so the power of the hand is developing nicely. But we are a little bit limited on mana. Okay, so the opponent again has to just tap 1 mana to play Mana Dork. We see that I drew a Harbinger of the Tides. I really needed to hit a land that turn, really wanted to hit a land that turn, because now our options become rather limited. Thinking that if our opponent does hit a land next turn, he will only have access to something like Heritage Druid. Well, if he does hit a land next turn, he can drop Heritage Druid and another Mana Dork, or another 1-drop, and create 3 mana and sort of start going nuts. But limited on mana myself, I realize that I need to start developing my own board. I play out a Lord, swing for 3, the opponent goes down to 17, untaps, and draws a Nettle Sentinel. So still starved for mana. He plays out a Nettle Sentinel and a Heritage Druid, setting him up for more mana in the following turn. I whiffed on mana again, myself that turn. And similar to the decision in game 1 where we brought in the Cursecatcher with AEther Vial to block and trade with his Heritage Druid, taking him off of this extremely powerful and explosive mana ability, I chose to use a Dismember this turn to get rid of the Heritage Druid. Unfortunately, similar to game 1, the opponent has a second Heritage Druid to back it up, and we'll see where that takes him next turn. But I chose to attack for 3 more damage, bring the opponent down to 14. We have Dispel up, but it's unlikely that the opponent is going to try to resolve a Collected Company with such limited access to mana this turn. But he does have a Heritage Druid. He taps it for 3 mana, plays an Elvish Visionary, which untaps Nettle Sentinel, and draws him a card. It is a Collected Company that he hits. He still has 1 mana floating from the 3 that he created after playing Visionary. He plays another Nettle Sentinel using that 1 floating, taps the original Nettle Sentinel and the next 2 Elves that he played for 3 more mana. He plays another Visionary, untaps the 2 Nettle Sentinels, still has 1 mana floating after the Visionary, draws him another card, which is a land. So the opponent's really opening up his game now. as, again, an elf player myself, I would have found it hard to resist playing out the Collected Company on my own main phase. He still had one mana floating and could create 3 more, bringing up to 4 and 5 through the Okina that he just played. Collected Company would untap the Nettle Sentinels and inevitably bring 2 more Elves to the table. It could have brought 2 Visionaries, which could have then combined with the Nettle Sentinels to tap and make more mana and play out whatever he draws with Visionaries. So with the opponent not playing the Collected Company on his own turn, it seemed unlikely that he would play it on my turn, and that unlikelihood affected my play in the following turn. Now, I did draw a land. Unfortunately, it's sort of my flex land, and it's colorless, prohibiting us from playing a 2-drop and leaving up Dispel, which probably would have been my play here in order to leverage the power of Dispel against 4 open mana. But being unable to play any of my spells and leave Dispel up this turn, I opt to continue to develop my board, playing out a Reejerey. And after thinking about it a little bit, I decide to attack with the Tidebinder Mage to continue pushing damage and threatening the opponent's life total. He takes 4 at first, begins to take damage, and then thinks better of it and begins to tap his creatures, resolving a Collected Company, hitting an Archdruid and an Elvish Mystic. He makes all of his creatures bigger, and were it me in this situation, I would have chosen to double block with 2 Nettle Sentinels, killing the Tidebinder Mage, untapping his Mystic next turn, and shrinking my board down at the same time. However, the opponent feels pretty comfortable, takes the 4 damage, and untaps, draws another land, and realizes that after my attack, he has 6 2/2s and 2 3/3s. If I choose to block his 2 3/3s, he pushes 12 around the edges for exact lethal. So that was an unfortunate game 2, an unfortunate loss in game 2. We had appropriate removal. We had access to 2 Dismembers and Dispel to interact with the opponent's plays, but it wasn't enough to get there. The second Heritage Druid really blew us out. So you can see this game 3 opening hand is a mulligan. So I opt to go down to 6. And this is a reasonable keep. We have 2 Spreading Seas. The opponent has been keeping really aggressive 1-land openers. So I scry here, and it's very interesting to note I see an island and choose to put the island on the bottom of the deck. The rationale behind that decision making is I already have 2 lands in hand. I'm going to draw a card next turn and play a Spreading Seas, most likely, draw another card, and then have access to 2 more draws off of the following turn if I play another Spreading Seas. Just giving me access to a lot of looks at the top of my deck, a lot of draws to potentially hit 1 or 2 more lands. If I chose to keep the island on the top, I could have drawn into even more lands below that. And so with access to all of this card draw, I felt that the island on the top of the deck would most likely be redundant, and we really just wanted to draw more gas and hope that the Spreading Seas draw us into our 1 or 2 more lands eventually. You'll see the way that this game develops that the choice of putting the island on the bottom is a very, very interesting one that we could consider right or wrong depending on which way you look at it. So the opponent keeps. He has a very solid hand with turn 1 Mana Dork into a potentially explosive turn 2 Heritage Druid play if he hits another 1-drop on turn 1 or 2. So I play an island and pass. The opponent draws Choke. So we can immediately see why putting mana on the bottom of my deck may potentially, could potentially be considered incorrect. With Choke, tapping down our only blue source, I really wanted access to that second blue source to make sure we can deploy both of our Spreading Seas early in the game to also keep our opponent's lands locked down with the Choke effect. But we couldn't know that he brought in Choke. We didn't see it in the second game. And so even knowing that, we may have put the island on the bottom anyway because islands get locked down by Choke. The opponent opens with Cavern into Mana Dork, and I go ahead and put Spreading Seas on his Cavern of Souls. Now, when the opponent plays Choke this turn, I don't think he's aware yet that Cavern of Souls won't untap. It's definitely worth noting at this moment in the game that Spreading Seas is one of our best ways to respond to the opponent deploying Choke, because we can have it backfire on them by locking down their own lands by turning them into islands. So our land won on tap this turn, and I proceeded to have a number of frustrating top decks, whiffing on my land drops and letting the opponent continue to develop his board. The opponent drew a redundant Uzuri and plays Spellskite out with the two mana that he has access to. I remind him that Cavern of Souls is going to get locked down, and he chooses here to deploy Spellskite, presumably in order to protect his Uzuri, which is inevitably going to come in a later turn. I think this is another slight misstep by the opponent. If he had played Elvish Visionary this turn, he could have played Heritage Druid on the next turn, giving him access to Heritage Druid's explosive mana ability, and playing out his hand faster and potentially closing out the game faster. The way that he played it conservatively here with Spellskite gives me more time to develop. I think the opponent feels a little bit too comfortable behind this Choke, and could potentially come back to haunt him. So now he taps his 2 mana, he drew into a land to play Visionary, he draws another land, and uses the Mystic to play Heritage Druid. Okay, I drew a land, but as you can see, it's a little bit frustrating. It doesn't give me access to blue mana to deploy Spreading Seas and keep our opponent's lands locked down. So again, I just have to pass the turn. I couldn't risk attacking with Mutavault into a double block. The opponent also had the Spellskite on board just to stonewall the Mutavault, and without a Lord, there's no Island Walk available. So we just have to sit back and wait to see what comes next. The opponent is sort of fully online at this point. He has 3 Elves to tap for mana, two green lands open, and can play whatever he wants. With access to sort of seeing his hand in the replay, we can see he doesn't have a ton apart from Uzuri here. But he goes ahead and plays Uzuri, and with another minor misstep, potentially you could consider it a major misstep, he could have deployed another Mystic that turn with this green mana. I don't know why he didn't do that. It was a strange decision. In any event, I drew into a Wanderwine Hub, which is probably one of the best possible draws. I go ahead and play the Wanderwine Hub. The opponent here aggressively asks me, "Good game." Now, this is something that I find, I don't know, just despicable. It doesn't put me on tilt. It doesn't make me sort of get angry and play worse. It just makes me think that my opponent is an ass. If your opponent's sitting back and thinking, and you have a pretty dominant board position, just wait. If your opponent has nothing, they'll scoop. If the opponent has something, they'll do their best, and you'll play out a more interesting game of Magic. So please just, if you feel like you've got the game won, just be patient. Wait for your opponent to come to the decision himself, and don't be sort of offensively aggressive. The opponent asks good game, and I tell him that I'm thinking. And the few choices here are to simply play out a Spreading Seas and lock down one of his lands. That seems suboptimal because the opponent's going to start pressuring us really hard next turn with Uzuri's Overrun ability. We could play a Tidebinder Mage, but both of these, or neither of these, are abilities require specific Elves to tap. This is a very flexible ability, and this just requires mana. So using Tidebinder Mage to tap down any particular green target doesn't seem the best here. Ultimately, I decide that Reejerey is the best, because if we continue drawing into lands, Reejerey gives us access to the most explosive plays. So I do go ahead and play the Wanderwine Hub, revealing Reejerey and playing Reejerey. The opponent untaps, draws another Mystic, which is nice because he gets to develop his board further. When you have Uzuri on the table, all you want is bodies to throw the Overrun ability onto and just trample for lethal damage. But looking here, you can see I'm still at 20. The opponent's not presenting a lot of pressure. He decides to play both of his Mystics, one of which he could have played last turn, but I think misplayed. And he can use Heritage Druid's ability to make 3 mana, 1 more mana from a Mystic, 1 from the Temple Garden, to activate Uzuri's Overrun ability and attack for 9 with Uzuri and Elvish Visionary, which I take and go down to 11. Here I drew into another Wanderwine Hub. So we can just talk for a second about why I'm running so many Wanderwine Hubs. Each of the last 3 days that I've played Magic on Cockatrice, I've run into Choke 3 times. Once against a Jund deck, once against an Abzan deck, and now against an Elves deck. Against the Jund deck, it just totally blew me out. I couldn't play Magic, I couldn't create mana. The same went for the Abzan deck, and I just totally got steamrolled. After those losses, I decided that it seemed there are a lot more green decks in the meta game right now, and with the rise of green decks in the meta, it seems reasonable to assume that Choke will see more play out of sideboards. And with that being the case, I needed to reduce my number of islands, which I did from 11 to 7, and just make a direct swap for 4 Wanderwine Hubs. This card, it does require us to reveal a Merfolk, but with us already revealing Merfolk cards for Silvergill's ability, often, this doesn't tax us much more, because if we have a Silvergill in hand anyway, we were going to reveal a Merfolk anyway, so we can reveal the Merfolk for Wanderwine Hub, untap Wanderwine Hub, and proceed to cast the Silvergill and reveal the same Merfolk. So the redundancy of this effect is not particularly negative. And you can see that having access to these kinds of lands in the deck is really important to give us options against this really powerful sideboard card. All right, so this is a really important turn for me, and I took a lot of time sort of figuring out the best path. I revealed a Master of the Pearl Trident to untap the Wanderwine Hub because I wasn't exactly sure what path I was going to take, but it seemed likely that I would potentially deploy at least one of my lords. But the more that I thought about it, I realized more and more that the opponent had pretty narrow access to the type of mana that Uzuri requires for his overrun effect, and also limited access to elves to attack me with. He didn't have a board with 12 attackers or something like that. He's got just 6 of them. And while Heritage Druid's ability can produce a lot of mana, it can only do so with a lot of elves on the table. So I begin to think that Spreading Seas is an appealing option because it reduces our opponent's access to mana, and we do have a Tidebinder Mage to back it up. So if we play Spreading Seas, draw a card, we could potentially hit a Harbinger of the Tides and bounce his Uzuri, which sets him back quite a lot, because if he taps 3 mana to replay Uzuri, he can't really activate Overrun and attack next turn at all. If we don't draw into a Harbinger of the Tides, we have Tidebinder Mage to back us up and lock down one of his mana dorks, further limiting his access to mana and attackers. So moving forward, I have to think about it quite a lot. It was a pretty difficult decision, but ultimately I came to the decision that locking down his lands while drawing a card, potentially drawing a Harbinger of the Tides, was my best avenue of sort of best approach here. The opponent, again, aggressively asking me good game. I'll remind you guys, please don't do this. It makes you look like an idiot. So I go ahead and draw a Cursecatcher, which, while not a Harbinger, is nice because it's a free Merfolk with Reejerey's ability. So we untap our Cavern after playing Cursecatcher, and since we didn't draw a Harbinger, we go ahead and play a Tidebinder Mage, locking down the Elvish Mystic, and with Reejerey's ability, we get to untap our island, which has been locked down for the entire game. That turn really shows the strength of Merrow Reejerey, I think. Being able to get this one extra land untapped will allow us to play more of our hand out next turn, which is really important to match up against the dense board state that Elves has developed. I think that Reejerey, you should always play 4 copies of this guy. The Lord ability is obviously really, really central and really just so important to Merfolk's strategy. And I think people really underestimate sometimes the power of and flexibility of his second ability. Being able to tap or untap anything is really, really strong. So we're going to have access to even more mana next turn because of Reejerey's ability. The opponent draws another Llanowar Elf, and realizing that he has access to substantially less mana than he did last turn because of my plays, it's not in his interest to attack this turn. I could potentially play 2 lords and attack for lethal. I draw into another land, which is good here because I want to play as much of this hand as possible. This island was untapped from Reejerey, and this is the island that I just drew and played. We can see that playing a lot of non-islands gives us game against this enchantment, which is really important because I have been seeing so much of it. So we can go ahead and just watch how this turn played out. We can play a lord and untap a land, play another lord and untap another land, having 4 lands untapped to deploy Master of Waves and untap one of our islands in case we need access to it next turn through choke. Counting the devotion, it's 11, bringing 22 power and 11 toughness to the table to absorb any potential overrun attacks. I could have poked in for some damage here with my Merfolk, but feeling that I could safely sit back and take any attack that the opponent had next turn, I could then just island walk for the win. The only available attackers this turn were Merrow Reejerey, Cursecatcher, and Tidebinder Mystic, and rather than risk the opponent having something like a Path to Exile, removing all my elementals and Master of Waves and leaving me with only 2 blockers and dying to surprise sort of overrun and removal, I play it safe, leave all my guys up, and force the opponent to have it. He draws a Heritage Druid, thinks about it a little bit, and ultimately realizes that he doesn't have it. If we look at his mana, he can produce 1, tap these 3 guys, making it 4 and 5. He's got 2 attackers for 9 power, which we can absorb with any number of blocks. And yeah, that was a pretty wild game. We got to see sort of choke, reducing my play a lot, keeping me from playing out my second Spreading Seas and drawing into more cards in the early part of the game. But really, we got to see these non-island blue sources shine against a metagame full of green decks. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please subscribe and like the videos, and please leave some comments if you have anything to say. And I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks a lot.